The coffee shop was like any other that Tuesday morning. The usual mix of students hunched over laptops, business people grabbing their caffeine fix, and regulars claiming their favorite corners. Behind the counter, Marcus Williams wiped down the espresso machine for the third time, his eyes occasionally drifting to the woman in the corner booth. She'd been coming in for 3 weeks now, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, no sugar, and a blueberry muffin she barely touched. She was quiet, unassuming, dressed in simple civilian clothes that gave no hint of who she really was. Her short, practical haircut and the way she carried herself might have suggested military background to a trained eye, but to Marcus, she was just another customer who left generous tips and never caused trouble. What Marcus didn't know was that the woman sitting just 15 feet away commanded the respect of over 50,000 naval personnel. Her word could move aircraft carriers across oceans, deploy submarines to classified locations, and coordinate military operations that shaped global politics. While he worried about whether they had enough whole milk for the morning rush, she carried the weight of national security on her shoulders. In a few minutes, Marcus would approach her table to offer a coffee refill, completely unaware that he was about to speak to one of the most powerful people in the United States military. Admiral Sarah Chun, fleet commander of the Pacific Fleet, had chosen his little coffee shop as her refuge from a world where every decision carried life-or-death consequences. Sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in the most ordinary places. And sometimes a simple conversation over coffee can reveal truths that change everything you thought you knew about power, sacrifice, and what it really means to serve your country. This is the story of how a barista learned that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and how a fleet commander discovered that strength sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. Marcus Williams had been working at Coastal Grounds Coffee for 2 years, and he prided himself on remembering every regular customer's order. Mrs. Patterson wanted her latte extra hot with a dash of cinnamon. Professor Goldman needed his double espresso exactly at 7:45 a.m., or his entire day would be thrown off schedule. The construction crew from a nearby site always ordered 6 large coffees, black, with enough sugar packets to fuel a small army. But the woman who'd started coming in 3 weeks ago was different. She arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at precisely 9:30 a.m., ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin, then sat in the same corner booth for exactly 1 hour. She never spoke on her phone, never opened a laptop, and barely touched the muffin. She just sat there, sipping her coffee slowly, watching the world go by through the large windows that faced the harbor. Marcus had tried to make conversation a few times, but she always responded politely, yet briefly. "Nice weather today," he'd say, and she'd nod with a small smile. "Yes, it is." When he mentioned the new seasonal menu, she'd thank him but stick to her usual order. She wasn't rude, just distant, like someone carrying invisible weight. The coffee shop sat on Harbor Boulevard, just 3 blocks from the naval base, so Marcus was used to military personnel stopping by. But they usually came in groups, laughing and joking, or hurried and alone wearing their uniforms, grabbing quick orders before rushing back to duty. This woman was different. She moved with purpose, but seemed to be hiding from something, or maybe seeking something she couldn't find. On this particular Thursday morning, Marcus noticed she looked more tired than usual. Her shoulders, normally held straight, seemed to sag slightly. Her eyes, which usually scanned the room with sharp awareness, appeared unfocused. When she ordered her usual coffee, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You okay today?" Marcus found himself asking as he handed her the steaming cup. She paused, looking genuinely surprised that someone had noticed. "Just a long week," she said, managing a tired smile. "Thanks for asking. Well, if you need anything stronger than coffee, I make a mean hot chocolate. Secret ingredient." Marcus grinned, trying to lighten her mood. For the first time since she'd been coming in, she actually laughed. It was brief but genuine. "I might take you up on that sometime." As she settled into her usual booth, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to this woman than met the eye. The way she sat with her back to the wall, how her eyes briefly assessed each new customer who entered, the fact that she never seemed surprised by the loud Navy jets that occasionally flew overhead, jets that made most other customers jump. Around 10:15, Marcus noticed a man in a sharp suit enter the cafe. His eyes immediately found the woman in the corner booth, and he approached her table with obvious urgency. Marcus tried not to eavesdrop, but he couldn't help overhearing fragments of their conversation. "Admiral, we need you back immediately. There's been a development with the Taiwan situation." "Admiral?" Marcus nearly dropped the cup he was washing. The quiet woman who left $5 tips on $3 coffee orders was an admiral. The conversation was brief and hushed. The woman, the admiral, nodded tersely, gathered her things, and stood to leave. As she passed the counter, she placed a $10 bill next to the register. "Keep the change, Marcus. And thank you for the conversation. It means more than you know." She knew his name. He wore a name tag, of course, but most customers never bothered to read it, let alone remember it. As she walked toward the door, Marcus called out, "See you next Tuesday?" She turned back with that tired smile. "If I'm lucky." After she left, Marcus found himself staring at the $10 bill. Admiral. The quiet woman who barely touched her blueberry muffins was a military officer high enough in rank to be addressed as Admiral. His mind raced through everything he knew about naval rankings. Admirals commanded fleets, made decisions that affected thousands of people, dealt with international crises. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Marcus found himself looking up information about the local naval base, trying to understand what kind of responsibilities an admiral might have. The base was home to the Pacific Fleet, he learned. The Pacific Fleet was responsible for all naval operations across the largest ocean on Earth, from the West Coast to Asia and Australia. It was massive, complex, and crucial to national security. That evening, as Marcus closed up the shop, he couldn't stop thinking about the contrast. Here was someone with enormous responsibility, someone whose decisions probably made international news, and she spent her brief moments of peace in a little coffee shop, watching boats in the harbor and leaving generous tips. He thought about his own life, the daily routine of opening the shop, serving coffee, making small talk with customers, worrying about inventory and scheduling. His biggest stress was usually running out of oat milk or dealing with a broken espresso machine. But this woman, this admiral, carried the weight of national security while maintaining the same calm demeanor she showed when ordering coffee. The next Tuesday, Marcus found himself watching the door anxiously around 9:30. Would she come back? The man in the suit had seemed urgent about whatever the Taiwan situation was. Maybe she was on a ship somewhere in the Pacific, dealing with international crises he'd only read about in headlines. At 9:28, she walked through the door. Relief flooded through Marcus, though he couldn't quite explain why. She looked better than the previous Thursday, more rested, shoulders back to their usual straight posture. But there was still something in her eyes, a weight that seemed heavier than before. "The usual?" Marcus asked as she approached the counter. "Actually," she said and paused, "I think I'll try that hot chocolate you mentioned, with the secret ingredient." Marcus grinned. "Coming right up, Admiral." She froze. For a moment, Marcus worried he'd overstepped, but then her expression softened. "You heard that conversation last week. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop. And I won't tell anyone, if you prefer." "It's fine, Marcus. I suppose I can't be Sarah Chun, regular customer, forever." She looked around the coffee shop, at the mismatched chairs, the local art on the walls, the chalkboard menu with Marcus's cheerful handwriting. "Though I was hoping to be her for just a little while longer." As Marcus prepared her hot chocolate, adding a dash of sea salt and a hint of vanilla, his actual secret ingredients, he realized he was looking at someone who rarely got to be just a person. Sarah Chun, the admiral, commanded fleets and made decisions that affected global politics. But Sarah Chun, the customer, just wanted to sit in a coffee shop, watch the harbor, and maybe have a conversation that didn't involve military strategy or international incidents. "Here you go," Marcus said, sliding the hot chocolate across the counter. "On the house. Consider it a thank you for your service." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, inhaling the rich aroma. Thank you. And Marcus? I hope you'll still call me Sarah when I come in. Admiral Chun has enough people calling her by rank all day. As she settled into her usual booth, Marcus realized that his little coffee shop had become something important to her. A refuge, a place where she could just be Sarah for an hour. And he felt honored to be part of that refuge, even in such a small way. The morning continued with its usual rhythm of customers and coffee orders, but Marcus found himself stealing glances at Sarah's table. She was working on something, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. Her phone buzzed several times, but she ignored it. For this hour, she was determined to be just Sarah, not Admiral Chun. When a group of young sailors came in around 10:15, Marcus noticed how they glanced at Sarah's table without recognition. She had mastered the art of blending in, of being invisible when she needed to be. It struck him as both impressive and somehow sad that someone with such responsibility had to work so hard just to have a normal cup of coffee. As Sarah prepared to leave, she stopped at the counter again. The hot chocolate was perfect, she said. I might have to make it my new usual. Whatever you need, Sarah. Same time Thursday. If the world behaves itself, until then. She smiled, but Marcus caught a hint of the weight she carried in those words. The world didn't often behave itself for people in her position. After she left, Marcus found himself wondering what kind of decisions she'd face that week, what global situations would demand her attention, what burdens she'd carry while maintaining that calm exterior. And he felt a new appreciation for the simple act of making someone's coffee exactly the way they needed it. The coffee shop, suddenly, felt like more than just a business. It was a small sanctuary where someone who commanded fleets could remember what it felt like to be treated as just another customer. And Marcus Williams, barista and keeper of coffee shop conversations, had become an unlikely guardian of that sanctuary. Thursday morning arrived with unusual fanfare in the harbor. Marcus noticed increased naval activity as he opened the coffee shop. More ships than normal, helicopters making frequent passes, and a general sense of heightened activity that even a civilian could detect. He wondered if this had anything to do with Sarah's world, but tried to focus on his morning routine of setting up tables and starting the espresso machine. Sarah arrived at exactly 9:30, but something was different. She wore the same casual civilian clothes, but her movements were more crisp, her posture more rigid. The weight in her eyes had intensified overnight. Hot chocolate again? Marcus asked, hoping to bring back some of the warmth from their previous interaction. Just black coffee today, she replied, and maybe make it a double. As Marcus prepared her order, he noticed her phone buzzing constantly. Each time, she glanced at it with a slight frown, then deliberately placed it face down on the table. Whatever was happening in her world, she was fighting hard to maintain her hour of normalcy. Busy day, Marcus ventured as he handed her the coffee. Sarah took a long sip before answering. You could say that. Sometimes I wonder if the world actually schedules its crises around my coffee breaks. It was the most personal thing she'd ever shared, and Marcus sensed she needed someone to talk to. Not Admiral Chun, but Sarah. You know, I used to work at a 24-hour diner before this place. Marcus said, leaning casually against the counter. We get all kinds of people during the late shifts. Nurses coming off double shifts, police officers dealing with whatever the night threw at them, EMTs who'd seen things they couldn't shake. They all had the same look you have right now. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly. What look is that? Like you're carrying everyone else's problems and forgetting to take care of yourself. The coffee shop was relatively quiet this morning, just a few students with laptops and an elderly couple sharing a newspaper. Sarah seemed to consider his words carefully. The nurse could go home and forget about the hospital for a while, she said quietly. But when your decisions affect, she paused, as if catching herself about to reveal too much. When people depend on you for their safety, there's no real clock-out time. Marcus had been wiping down the same section of counter for the past minute, using it as an excuse to continue the conversation. But you can't make good decisions if you're exhausted, right? Even I know that if I don't get enough sleep, I'll mess up someone's latte. Sarah actually smiled at that. The difference is, Your worst mistake might upset someone's morning. Mine could start a war. The weight of that statement hung in the air between them. Marcus had read news articles about rising tensions in the South China Sea, about naval exercises, and diplomatic warnings. He'd never considered that somewhere behind those headlines was a person like Sarah, making impossible decisions with incomplete information and enormous consequences. That's why you come here, Marcus realized. This is the only place where you're not responsible for anything more serious than whether you want a muffin. Something like that. Sarah's phone buzzed again, and this time she couldn't ignore it. She read the message, and Marcus saw her shoulders tense. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Of course. Do you ever get the feeling that you're living someone else's life? That somewhere along the way, you made choices that led you so far from who you thought you'd be that you can't even remember what you originally wanted? The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd expected something about coffee or the weather, not this deep philosophical inquiry from someone who commanded naval fleets. I mean, I studied journalism in college, he admitted. Thought I'd be writing important stories, maybe changing the world with my reporting. Instead, I'm here making lattes. But you know what? Some days I think I learn more about people in this coffee shop than I ever would have in a newsroom. Like right now. I'm talking to someone who probably has more interesting stories than any journalist could imagine, and she just wants to have a normal conversation about whether her life turned out like she planned. Sarah stared into her coffee cup. I wanted to be a teacher. Elementary school. I love the idea of shaping young minds, helping kids discover what they were passionate about. I joined the Navy to pay for college, thinking I'd do my service and get out. 26 years later, I'm responsible for the security of half the Pacific Ocean. Do you regret it? She was quiet for a long moment. I'm good at what I do. Really good. I can coordinate complex operations, make strategic decisions under pressure, and I genuinely believe I'm helping keep people safe. But sometimes I wonder what classroom I'd be teaching in right now, what kids would be driving me crazy with their questions, what science projects would be exploding in my face. Her phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. Sarah glanced at it and sighed. And sometimes I wonder if the world would be better off if I'd stuck to teaching third grade instead of learning how to move destroyers around like chess pieces. Before Marcus could respond, the coffee shop door opened with unusual force. The same man in the sharp suit from the previous week entered, but this time he looked genuinely urgent. He scanned the room, spotted Sarah, and approached her table with barely contained energy. Admiral, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. The Chinese fleet has moved into disputed waters near Taiwan, and they're not responding to our communications. The president wants to speak with you immediately. Sarah's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The woman who'd been contemplating alternate life paths became Admiral Chun, fleet commander. Her back straightened. Her voice became crisp and authoritative. How many ships? 16 vessels, including 3 destroyers and a submarine. Intelligence suggests they're testing our response time. Sarah stood, leaving her barely touched coffee on the table. She pulled out a $20 bill and placed it next to her cup. Marcus, I'm sorry to cut this short. Sarah, Marcus said quietly, so the suited man couldn't hear. For what it's worth, I think those third graders missed out on having an incredible teacher. But right now, there are sailors out there who are really lucky to have you making the tough decisions. She paused at his words, and for just a moment he saw both Sarah the person and Admiral Chun the commander in her expression. Thank you, she said simply. That means more than you know. As she walked toward the door with the suited man, Marcus heard fragments of their conversation. Coordinate with the 7th Fleet. Diplomatic channels. Rules of engagement if they don't withdraw. After they left, the coffee shop felt strangely empty. Marcus stared at the $20 bill Sarah had left, thinking about the conversation they'd just had. Here was someone who controlled massive military resources, whose decisions could prevent or trigger international conflicts, and she questioned whether she was living the right life. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Marcus found himself checking news websites on his phone during quiet moments, looking for any mention of naval activity near Taiwan. Around noon, he found a brief article about increased naval presence in the South China Sea, but it gave no real details. He wondered if Sarah was on a ship somewhere right now, coordinating movements he couldn't even imagine, making decisions that would never make it into the headlines unless something went terribly wrong. That afternoon, an older man came into the coffee shop. He was clearly military, the bearing, the haircut, the way he assessed the room upon entering. He ordered black coffee and struck up a conversation with Marcus. "You know Admiral Chun, don't you?" the man asked casually. Marcus was immediately on guard. "I know a lot of customers." "Why?" The man smiled. "I'm Captain Rodriguez, her deputy. She mentioned this place, said you make excellent hot chocolate. I can see why she likes coming here. Quiet, peaceful, good coffee. Is she okay? She had to leave pretty suddenly this morning." Captain Rodriguez's expression became serious. "She's doing what she does best, keeping a lot of people safe. But I'll tell you something, in all my years working with her, I've never seen her as relaxed as she's been these past few weeks. Whatever you're doing here, it's helping her remember who she is underneath all the responsibility. I just make coffee and listen when people want to talk. Sometimes that's exactly what someone needs." Rodriguez finished his coffee and stood to leave. "She asked me to tell you she hopes to see you next Tuesday, assuming the world behaves itself between now and then." That evening, as Marcus closed the shop, he thought about the strange turn his day had taken. This morning he'd been having a philosophical conversation with Sarah about life choices and regrets. By afternoon, she was somewhere in the Pacific, potentially preventing an international incident. The contrast was staggering. He thought about her question, whether he felt like he was living someone else's life. In a way, he supposed he was. He'd never planned to become the keeper of a sanctuary for a fleet commander, someone who provided a brief escape from the weight of global responsibility. But maybe that's how the most important things happened. Not through grand plans, but through small acts of kindness, normal conversations, and really good hot chocolate. Marcus locked the door and headed home, wondering what news would greet him tomorrow, and hoping that Sarah would be back on Tuesday to tell him how the world had behaved itself. The weekend passed with Marcus glued to news channels, watching for any coverage of naval activities in the Pacific. Saturday brought reports of routine naval exercises and diplomatic communications between Washington and Beijing. Sunday featured expert analysis about tensions in the South China Sea. But nowhere in the sanitized news coverage could Marcus see the human face of these events. Sarah, somewhere in the middle of it all, making decisions that kept these tensions from escalating into something much worse. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the coffee shop. Marcus was restocking the pastry case when a young woman in naval uniform approached the counter. She was probably mid-20s, with the crisp bearing of someone early in her career, but seasoned enough to handle responsibility. "Are you Marcus?" she asked. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm Lieutenant Parker from Admiral Chen's staff. She asked me to stop by and let you know she's hoping to keep her Tuesday appointment, but she wanted you to know she might be late." Marcus felt a mix of relief and concern. "Is she okay? Is everything?" Lieutenant Parker smiled. "She's fine, just dealing with some international diplomacy that's taking longer than expected. She also asked me to order a large hot chocolate with your secret ingredients to go. Said she might need it for a long day." As Marcus prepared the hot chocolate, adding the sea salt and vanilla that had become Sarah's favorite, Lieutenant Parker looked around the coffee shop with obvious curiosity. "She talks about this place, the lieutenant said. Says it's the only spot where she can think clearly. She seems to carry a lot of weight, more than most people could handle. But she's remarkable at what she does. The situation that called her away Thursday, she managed to defuse it without a single shot being fired. 3 different naval fleets were positioned for potential conflict, and she coordinated communications that led to a peaceful withdrawal. It was textbook crisis management. Marcus handed her the hot chocolate, processing this information. She prevented a battle. She prevented what could have been a much larger conflict. The Admiral has a gift for seeing solutions that others miss. finding ways to give everyone an honorable way to step back from confrontation. Lieutenant Parker accepted the drink. She said to tell you that sometimes the most important victories are the ones nobody hears about. After the lieutenant left, Marcus found himself looking at his coffee shop differently. This wasn't just a place where people grabbed their morning caffeine fix. It was somehow connected to international peacekeeping. The quiet woman who sat in the corner booth and barely touched her blueberry muffins had prevented a naval battle just 4 days ago. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that made everyone want to stay inside with warm drinks. Marcus opened the shop as usual, but found himself watching the door more anxiously than normal. At 9:30 exactly, Sarah walked in, and Marcus had never been so happy to see a customer. She looked exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Please tell me you have that hot chocolate ready," she said with a tired smile. "Lieutenant Parker picked one up yesterday, but I can make you a fresh one." "How did everything go?" Sarah settled into her usual booth with a deep sigh. "It went well. Better than well, actually. Sometimes the best military strategy is knowing when not to use military force." Marcus brought her the hot chocolate and, after checking that the coffee shop was relatively empty, sat down across from her. "Lieutenant Parker mentioned you prevented some kind of conflict. Did she?" "She's a good kid, but she tended to dramatize things." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Though I suppose preventing 23 ships from potentially firing on each other could be considered significant." 23 ships. Marcus tried to imagine that many naval vessels in one area, all ready for battle. Chinese fleet, our fleet, and Japanese maritime self-defense force vessels all converging on the same patch of ocean, none of them willing to back down first. The kind of situation that can escalate very quickly if someone makes the wrong move. How do you even manage something like that? Sarah took a sip of her hot chocolate, and Marcus could see her choosing her words carefully. A lot of it comes down to understanding people. Each fleet commander has their orders, their pride, their nation's interests to protect. But they're also human beings who don't want to be responsible for starting a war. You find ways to let everyone claim victory while actually de-escalating the situation. Like what? In this case, we proposed joint anti-piracy exercises. Everyone got to maintain their presence in the area, demonstrate their naval capabilities, and accomplish something useful. The Chinese admiral could report that he'd successfully defended their territorial claims while participating in international cooperation. The Japanese could show they were protecting shipping lanes. We could demonstrate alliance solidarity. Everyone wins, nobody loses face. Marcus was amazed. "You came up with that solution?" Military academies teach tactics and strategy, but they don't really prepare you for the psychology of international diplomacy. You learn that on the job, usually while trying not to make catastrophic mistakes. Sarah smiled ruefully. "The hardest part isn't moving ships around the ocean. It's understanding what each person needs to feel they can step back without looking weak." "Is that why you come here?" "To remember what normal human interaction feels like." Sarah considered this. "Partly, but also because you ask questions like a person, not like a subordinate or a superior or a political ally. When you ask how my day was, you actually want to know, not because you need to assess my decision-making capability or my political reliability." The morning rush was starting to pick up, and Marcus reluctantly returned to the counter to serve other customers. But he found himself stealing glances at Sarah's table, seeing her in an entirely new light. She wasn't just someone with an important job. She was someone whose personal qualities, her ability to understand human nature and find creative solutions, had literally prevented an international crisis. Around 10:15, a well-dressed woman approached Sarah's table. Marcus couldn't help but overhear part of their conversation. "Admiral, the Secretary of Defense wants to brief the President on last week's situation. He'd like you in Washington tomorrow for the meeting." Sarah nodded. "Of course. Schedule it for after 1400 hours if possible. I have something I need to do in the morning." After the woman left, Sarah brought her empty cup to the counter. "Marcus, I need to ask you a favor." "Anything." I'm going to Washington tomorrow to brief some very important people about recent events. They're going to want to know about strategy and tactics and geopolitical implications. But the truth is, the breakthrough moment came when I was sitting in that booth, thinking about our conversation last Thursday. Our conversation, you asked if I ever felt like I was living someone else's life. And I realized that maybe the problem wasn't that I'd ended up in the wrong life, but that I'd forgotten how to integrate who I am as a person with what I do professionally. Sarah leaned against the counter. When I was trying to figure out how to help 3 different fleet commanders step back from a confrontation without losing face, I thought about what you said about understanding people, about how you learn more about human nature working in this coffee shop than you might in a newsroom. Marcus was stunned. My coffee shop wisdom helped prevent a naval battle. Your reminder that leadership is ultimately about understanding people helped me remember that those fleet commanders weren't just military strategists. They were human beings with fears and pride and pressure from their superiors. Once I started thinking about what each of them needed as people, rather than just as representatives of their governments, the solution became obvious. I can't believe that something I said, Marcus, you provide something really important here. Not just coffee and conversation, but perspective. A reminder that behind all the complicated global politics and military strategy, we're all just people trying to figure out how to do the right thing. Sarah pulled out her wallet. The favor I need to ask is this. When I come back from Washington, probably Thursday, can we have a longer conversation? I want to understand how you see people, how you read what they need. I think it might make me better at my job. As Sarah left the coffee shop, Marcus realized that his simple questions and observations about human nature had somehow contributed to international peace. The barista who'd never traveled farther than Portland had influenced military strategy in the Pacific Ocean. The rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday passed in a strange blur. Marcus found himself paying attention to customers differently, wondering what pressures they might be carrying, what human needs might be hidden behind their coffee orders. The businessman who always seemed rushed, was he stressed about deadlines or struggling with something more personal? The college student who studied alone for hours, was she focused or lonely? Every interaction, suddenly, felt more significant, more connected to the larger human story that Sarah had helped him see. He began to understand that his coffee shop wasn't just a business. It was a place where people could be themselves for a few minutes, where someone might listen without judgment, where even a fleet commander could remember what it felt like to be just Sarah. Thursday morning couldn't come fast enough. Marcus wanted to hear about Washington, about briefing the Secretary of Defense, about how the story of prevented conflict had been received by people who made decisions at the highest levels of government. But more than that, he was curious about the longer conversation Sarah had requested, about what a barista could possibly teach a fleet commander about reading people and understanding human nature. When Sarah walked through the door at 9:30 Thursday morning, she looked different again, more confident, more integrated somehow, like someone who had figured out how to be both Admiral Chun and Sarah in the same person. How did Washington go? Marcus asked as he prepared her hot chocolate without being asked. Better than I expected. Turns out that prevention and creative problem solving are more impressive to politicians than firepower and aggressive positioning. They want me to develop new protocols for similar situations. Sarah accepted the hot chocolate with a grateful smile. And they want to understand how I came up with the joint exercise solution. Which brings me to that conversation I mentioned. Marcus glanced around the coffee shop. It was relatively quiet, and his part-time employee had just arrived for her shift. I have some time if you want to talk now. Actually, Sarah said, I was wondering if you'd be interested in having lunch sometime this week. Away from the coffee shop. I like to hear your thoughts about reading people and understanding what they need, but I'd also like to tell you more about what your perspective has meant to my work. Marcus realized she was asking him to lunch, not as Admiral Chun consulting with a civilian, but as Sarah wanting to continue a friendship that had somehow helped prevent an international crisis. And he found himself looking forward to discovering what other insights might emerge from the most unlikely friendship he'd ever developed. The restaurant Sarah chose for lunch was a small seafood place overlooking the harbor, casual enough that she could blend in while offering a view of the naval base in the distance. Marcus arrived a few minutes early, still somewhat amazed that he was having lunch with someone who commanded aircraft carriers and prevented international conflicts. Sarah appeared exactly on time, wearing civilian clothes that somehow made her look both more relaxed and more approachable than she did in the coffee shop. As they settled into a table by the window, Marcus noticed how she automatically chose a seat that let her observe the entire restaurant while keeping the harbor in her peripheral vision. "Force of habit," she said, noticing his observation. 26 years of military service teaches you to always know your surroundings. Do you ever get to turn that off? Not really, but I've learned to appreciate what it shows me about people. Sarah studied the menu briefly. "Speaking of which, tell me what you see when you look around this restaurant." Marcus glanced around, unsure what kind of observation she was looking for. Normal lunch crowd. Business people, a few tourists. That couple by the window seems to be celebrating something. Good start. What makes you think they're celebrating? She's dressed up more than necessary for a casual lunch. He keeps checking his phone like he's nervous, and there's a small gift box on the table between them. Sarah smiled. "Now tell me about the man at the bar." Marcus looked more carefully. A middle-aged man sat alone, occasionally glancing at his watch. Nursing a beer he didn't seem particularly interested in drinking. He's waiting for someone who's late. But he doesn't look angry or worried. Like maybe he's meeting someone he hasn't seen in a while, and he's not sure how it'll go. Excellent. What about the server taking orders from that table of 4 women? Marcus watched the interaction. She's new, maybe? She's checking her notes more than an experienced server would, but she's trying really hard to get everything right. The women are being patient with her, which suggests they've all been servers before, or they're just genuinely nice people. "This is exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Sarah said as their own server approached. After they ordered, she leaned forward. "Marcus, what you just did, reading the emotional subtext of ordinary situations, that's exactly the skill I need to get better at on a much larger scale." "I don't understand." "Let me give you an example from last week's situation. We had 3 naval fleets converging on disputed waters. The Chinese admiral was under pressure from Beijing to maintain their territorial claims. The Japanese commander was dealing with domestic political pressure to show strength against Chinese expansion. Our fleet commander was trying to balance alliance obligations with avoiding unnecessary escalation." Marcus nodded, trying to follow the complexity. Traditional military analysis would focus on ship positions, weapons capabilities, rules of engagement. But the breakthrough came when I started thinking about those 3 commanders as people. The Chinese admiral was probably as concerned about looking weak to his superiors as he was about the territorial dispute. The Japanese commander likely wanted to demonstrate resolve without provoking a larger conflict. Our commander needed to show alliance support while keeping everyone safe. "So you approached it like a relationship problem instead of a military problem?" "Exactly. Once I understood what each person needed to feel successful, not just what their governments wanted, but what they needed personally to maintain their professional standing, the solution became clear." Their food arrived, and Marcus found himself thinking about this perspective. It's like when someone comes into the coffee shop obviously having a bad day. I could just take their order and move on, or I could try to figure out what might actually help them feel better. Perfect analogy. Except instead of making someone's day better with good coffee and conversation, I'm trying to prevent conflicts that could affect millions of people. Sarah paused to try her fish. But the core skill is the same, reading what people need beneath what they're saying they want. How did you develop this approach? I mean, military academies probably don't teach advanced empathy for international crisis management. Sarah laughed. "You're right, they don't. I learned it through necessity. Actually, early in my career, I was assigned to coordinate joint operations with allied navies. You quickly discover that different military cultures have different communication styles, different concepts of hierarchy, different ways of expressing concern or disagreement." She looked out at the harbor, where a naval vessel was slowly making its way toward the base. I remember one joint exercise with the South Korean Navy where everything was going wrong because their admiral felt our plan didn't adequately respect their vessel's capabilities. He couldn't say that directly. It would have been diplomatically inappropriate. But you could see it in his body language, in how his officers were responding to orders, in the subtle delays in their communications. What did you do? I requested a private meeting and asked him to help me understand how we could better integrate Korean naval strengths into the exercise. Suddenly, instead of feeling dismissed, he felt consulted. He offered suggestions that actually improved our strategy, and the rest of the exercise went smoothly. Marcus was beginning to see the pattern. You made him feel valued instead of just compliant. Right. And that experience taught me that even in military operations, you're ultimately dealing with human beings who have professional pride, personal fears, and complex motivations. The more senior you become, the more your job is about understanding and working with those human elements. Is that why you come to the coffee shop? To remember the human element. Sarah considered this while finishing her lunch. Partly, but also because you've helped me understand something important about leadership. When you make someone feel seen and understood, they're more likely to trust you. When they trust you, they're more willing to consider solutions they might otherwise reject. I just try to pay attention to people. Marcus, you do more than pay attention. You care about whether someone's day gets better because of their interaction with you. That's not just customer service. That's emotional intelligence applied to real-world problem solving. Their server approached to check on them, and Marcus watched Sarah interact with her. She asked about the server's day, complimented the restaurant's atmosphere, and left a generous tip while making genuine eye contact. Marcus realized he was seeing the same approach that had prevented naval conflicts applied to a simple lunch interaction. I have a proposition for you, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. I'm developing new training protocols for naval officers who handle international coordination. Would you be interested in consulting on the human dynamics component? Marcus nearly choked on his water. Me? Consulting on military training? You? Teaching officers how to read what people need beneath what they're saying, how to recognize emotional subtext in high-pressure situations, how to build trust quickly with people from different cultural backgrounds. The skills you use every day in your coffee shop apply to international relations. I don't know anything about military protocol or international law, or we have plenty of people who know protocol and law. What we need is someone who understands people. Someone who can help officers remember that behind every uniform, every national flag, every official position, there's a human being trying to do their job well while managing their own pressures and concerns. As they walked back toward the coffee shop, Marcus tried to process this unexpected turn in his life. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a barista whose biggest professional challenge was remembering complex latte orders. Now he was being asked to help train naval officers in human dynamics for international crisis management. Can I ask you something? Marcus said. Why me specifically? There must be professional consultants, psychology experts, diplomacy specialists who could do this better. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. Because you don't see ranks or positions or political implications. You see people. When you look at me, you don't see Admiral Chun, fleet commander. You see Sarah, someone who looks tired and might need a good hot chocolate and a normal conversation. She gestured toward the harbor, where several naval vessels were visible in the distance. Those ships represent enormous military capability and complex international relationships. But they're operated by people who miss their families, worry about doing their jobs well, feel pressure from their superiors, and sometimes just need someone to acknowledge that they're doing difficult work in challenging circumstances. So you want me to help officers remember the human side of military operations? I want you to help them understand that recognizing the human side often makes military operations more successful, not less. That empathy isn't weakness, it's strategic intelligence. They'd reached the coffee shop, and Marcus could see customers through the windows, each with their own stories and needs and challenges. His regular job suddenly felt connected to something much larger And more important, if I did this consulting work, would I still be able to run the coffee shop? Absolutely. In fact, I'd insist on it. The coffee shop is where you've developed these skills. It needs to remain your primary laboratory for understanding people. Sarah smiled. Besides, I still need my Tuesday and Thursday hot chocolate appointments. They become essential to my ability to do my job well. As they stood outside Coastal Grounds Coffee, Marcus realized that his small coffee shop had somehow become a crucial component of international peacekeeping. The conversation skills he developed while serving lattes and listening to customers' problems were now being recognized as valuable tools for preventing military conflicts. Okay, he said finally. I'll try it. But I have one condition. What's that? You have to promise that no matter how official this consulting work becomes, we'll still have our regular coffee shop conversations. I like being the person you can talk to about whether you're living the right life and what you wanted to be when you grew up. Sarah extended her hand for a formal handshake, then thought better of it and gave him a quick hug instead. Deal. Some relationships are too valuable to let them become purely professional. As Sarah walked back toward the naval base and Marcus prepared to return to his afternoon shift, he realized that the most important skills he possessed weren't complex or sophisticated. They were simple human capacities, the ability to listen, to notice what people needed, to care about whether someone's day got better because of their interaction with him. He'd never imagined that these simple skills could contribute to international peace. But as he watched Sarah disappear into the distance, presumably to return to coordinating naval operations and managing global crises, Marcus understood that his small coffee shop had become proof of something important, that paying attention to the human element in any situation, whether serving coffee or preventing conflicts, was never just a nice gesture. It was often the key to everything else working properly. 6 months after that lunch conversation, Marcus Williams found himself in the most surreal situation of his life, standing in a conference room at the Naval War College, looking at a room full of officers from 6 different countries, about to teach them about reading human emotions and building trust across cultural boundaries. The coffee shop still operated as usual. Marcus had hired additional staff to cover for his consulting days, but his world had expanded in ways he never could have imagined. What started as simple conversations with a regular customer had evolved into a new approach to international military cooperation that was being studied and implemented across the Pacific Fleet. "Good morning," Marcus said to the assembled officers. "I know this is probably different from your usual training sessions. I'm not going to talk about military strategy or international law. Instead, I want to talk about something that happened in my coffee shop last Tuesday." He clicked to his first slide, which showed a photo of Coastal Grounds Coffee. A naval officer came in, clearly having a difficult day. He ordered black coffee, sat alone, and spent an hour staring at his phone without making any calls. Everything about his body language said he wanted to talk to someone, but he didn't know how to ask for conversation. The officers leaned forward, intrigued despite themselves. Traditional customer service would have been to take his order and leave him alone. But I noticed he kept looking up every time someone laughed or had a conversation. So I approached his table and asked if he'd ever tried our sea salt caramel cookies. Not because I thought he wanted cookies, but because I wanted to give him an opening for human interaction. Marcus paused, making eye contact with several officers in the room. It turned out he'd just received orders for a deployment that would keep him away from his new daughter for 8 months. He didn't need coffee advice. He needed someone to acknowledge that military service sometimes requires really difficult personal sacrifices. Commander Sarah Chun, now wearing her dress uniform for this official training session, watched from the back of the room with obvious pride. The program they developed together had exceeded both their expectations. The principle applies directly to international military cooperation, Marcus continued. When you're working with allied forces, everyone involved is dealing with pressure from their home governments, concerns about their professional standing, and often personal stress about being far from home in high-stakes situations. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a map of recent joint naval exercises. 3 months ago, Admiral Chin coordinated an exercise involving American, Japanese, Australian, and Indian naval forces. The initial planning meetings were tense because each navy had different protocols, different communication styles, and different levels of concern about sharing sensitive information. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto from the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force raised his hand. I was involved in those planning meetings. They were challenging. Tell us what you observed. Marcus encouraged. The Australian commander seemed frustrated with our decision-making process. The Indian liaison appeared concerned that his vessels were being assigned secondary roles. The American planning officer was clearly under time pressure and becoming impatient with our questions about operational details. Marcus nodded. Classic example of everyone having legitimate concerns, but not knowing how to express them constructively. What would have happened if those tensions had continued? The exercise probably would have proceeded, but with minimal real cooperation. Each Navy would have completed their assigned tasks without much integration or learning from each other, Commander Yamamoto admitted. Instead, Admiral Chin applied what we call the coffee shop approach. She requested individual meetings with each commander to understand their specific concerns and constraints. Not to argue with their concerns, but to genuinely understand what each person needed to feel confident about the exercise. Marcus clicked to a photo showing all 4 naval commanders signing a joint cooperation agreement. The Australian commander needed assurance that Australian naval capabilities would be prominently featured. The Indian liaison wanted confirmation that his fleet would have meaningful roles in all major scenarios. The American officer needed a clear timeline that would satisfy his superior's scheduling requirements. Once Admiral Chun understood what each person needed professionally and personally, she was able to redesign the exercise so that everyone could achieve their objectives while actually improving overall cooperation. A Royal Australian Navy captain spoke up. I was the frustrated Australian commander. That exercise became one of the most successful joint operations I've participated in. But I don't understand how a coffee shop barista developed insights that military leadership courses don't cover. Marcus smiled. Because in a coffee shop, you learn that people don't usually tell you what they actually need. They tell you what they think they should need, or what they think is acceptable to ask for. Real listening means paying attention to what someone isn't saying, reading the emotions behind their words, and caring enough to help them feel understood. He shared several more examples from recent international cooperation successes, each one illustrating how understanding human dynamics had improved military outcomes. The officers began contributing their own experiences, describing situations where cultural misunderstandings or personal tensions had complicated military objectives. The most important lesson, Marcus concluded, is that acknowledging someone's humanity doesn't make you weak or unprofessional. It makes you more effective. When people feel respected and understood, they're more willing to compromise, more creative in finding solutions, and more committed to shared success. After the session, several officers approached Marcus with questions about specific situations they were handling. A Korean naval captain asked about working with officers who seemed resistant to sharing information. A Canadian commander wanted advice on helping his crew adjust to extended deployment stress. Each conversation reinforced Marcus's growing understanding that military service, like coffee service, was fundamentally about human relationships. Admiral Chin joined him as the room cleared. How does it feel to be an official Naval War College instructor? Terrifying and exhilarating, Marcus admitted, though I still can't quite believe this is my life now. The feedback has been remarkable. Officers are reporting improved cooperation in joint exercises, better communication with allied forces, and more successful resolution of operational tensions. Sarah paused by the window overlooking the harbor. But the most significant impact might be on the officers themselves. They're finding their jobs more satisfying when they remember that they're working with people, not just military units. What's next for the program? We're expanding it to other fleet commands. The Pentagon wants to develop similar training for Army and Air Force cooperation. And there's interest from NATO allies in adapting the approach for multinational operations. Marcus watched a group of officers walking toward the harbor, their conversation animated and collaborative. It's strange to think that paying attention to customers in a coffee shop could end up influencing military cooperation on multiple continents. It's not strange at all, Sarah said. You developed expertise in the most fundamental aspect of human cooperation, understanding what people need and helping them feel valued. Those skills scale up to any level of organization. They walked together toward the parking area, passing sailors and officers going about their daily duties. Marcus had learned to see the naval base differently now, not as an intimidating military complex, but as a workplace where people were trying to do important, difficult jobs while managing their own personal challenges and professional pressures. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they reached Sarah's car. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of our early coffee shop conversations? When you were just a customer who wanted to sit quietly for an hour?" Sarah considered this. "I treasure those conversations because they remind me who I am underneath all the responsibility. But I don't miss feeling like I had to choose between being Admiral Chun and being Sarah. This work we're doing together has helped me understand that the best leadership integrates personal humanity with professional capability. So you don't feel like you're living someone else's life anymore. I feel like I'm finally living my own life, but in a way that serves something larger than myself. Teaching third grade would have been wonderful, but this work reaches more people and potentially prevents more problems." Sarah smiled. "Besides, I get to teach in a different way now, helping officers learn skills that make their service more effective and more personally satisfying." As Sarah drove away, Marcus realized that their unlikely friendship had created something neither of them could have anticipated. What began as a fleet commander seeking refuge from responsibility had become a collaboration that was changing how military personnel approached international cooperation. The drive back to the coffee shop gave Marcus time to reflect on the day's session. Every question the officers had asked, every example they'd shared, reinforced the same basic truth, that paying attention to human needs and emotions wasn't separate from professional effectiveness. It was essential to it. Back at Coastal Grounds Coffee, Marcus found the afternoon rush in full swing. His staff was handling orders efficiently, customers were enjoying conversations at their tables, and the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Everything looked exactly as it had 6 months ago, but Marcus now understood that this small coffee shop had become the laboratory for insights that were influencing military cooperation around the world. A young sailor approached the counter, clearly nervous about something. Instead of just taking his order, Marcus found himself paying attention to the human story behind the request. The sailor needed caffeine for a long shift, but more importantly, he needed someone to notice that he was struggling with something and maybe offer a moment of encouragement. "First deployment?" Marcus asked as he prepared the sailor's coffee. "Is it that obvious?" "Not obvious, just recognizable. It gets easier, and the work you're doing matters, even when it doesn't feel that way." The sailor's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thanks. I needed to hear that today." As Marcus handed over the coffee, he realized that every customer interaction was an opportunity to apply the same principles that were now being taught at the Naval War College. Whether someone was ordering a latte or coordinating international naval exercises, the fundamental challenge was the same: understanding what people needed, helping them feel valued, and finding ways to make their day better because of the interaction. That evening, as Marcus closed the coffee shop, he thought about the journey from making coffee for a quiet, regular customer to teaching human dynamics to military officers from around the world. The skills hadn't changed: listening carefully, noticing what people needed, caring about their experience. But the scale and impact had expanded far beyond anything he could have imagined. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Excellent session today. The Korean captain wants to implement your approach with his entire crew. Coffee Thursday to plan the next program expansion." Marcus smiled as he turned off the lights and locked the door. Tomorrow he'd be back to making lattes and chatting with customers about their daily concerns. Thursday, he'd be planning military training programs that would affect international cooperation across the Pacific. And somehow, Both roles were exactly what he was meant to be doing. The most extraordinary thing about his unlikely journey was how natural it had become. Whether serving coffee or consulting on military cooperation, the work was fundamentally the same, helping people feel understood, valued, and connected to something meaningful. The setting might change, but the human element remained constant. As Marcus walked home through the quiet streets, he could see the naval base in the distance, its lights reflecting on the harbor water. Somewhere out there, officers trained in his programs were working to prevent conflicts and build cooperation between nations. And tomorrow morning, some of them would probably stop by his coffee shop for a normal interaction with a barista who understood that every conversation was an opportunity to make the world a little bit better.